The following is a presentation for Kevin Corley's novel, 13 Steps for Charlie Birger. Charlie Birger's legend might have begun the day the sheriff allowed him to keep his Tommy gun in the jail cell with him. Or it might have begun the year he teamed up with the notorious Shelton gang to fight a bloody war against Glenn Young and his 3,000 Ku Klux Klan members. Others might say it was how he lived his life, or more importantly, how he ultimately died. No matter the reasons for Charlie's fame, everyone agrees he left behind a trail of gruesome corpses. This novel is based on the incredible true story of the Shelton and Birger gangs, who built a bootlegging empire that rivaled anything in Al Capone Chicago during the prohibition years of the 1920s. Many readers of Corley's first novel, 16 Tons, asked about a chapter on the Shelton gang in which they tried to rob a Cairo, Illinois bank on September 27, 1924. This led me to write the novel 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, which tells the fact-based story of two rival bootlegging gangs in the 1920s, one led by Charlie Birger and the other by the three notorious Shelton brothers. At first, the gangs band together to fight bloody wars against Glenn Young and his Ku Klux Klan. Later, the gangs will use any means available to knock each other off, including homemade tanks and even an airplane in one of the first aerial bombings in the United States. Many of the drawings in this presentation come from a 1948 comic book called The Short, Bloody Life of Charlie Birger. Also, so that you won't be bored, I've added a few photographs from some of my favorite classic movies. You may enjoy trying to guess the actor and the film. Charlie Birger lived from 1881 to 1928. He was born in Russia as a Jew and raised in St. Louis. He served in the U.S. Cavalry out west. In his later years, his personality was affected by a morphine addiction. He lived most of his adult life in Harrisburg, Illinois. Charlie liked to pay with $2 bills and always carried a pocket full of coins to hand out to children. It was said that Charlie would drive around Harrisburg in the middle of the night and leave buckets of coal and groceries on the porches of folks who had fallen on hard times. When young Joe Chestnut robbed an elderly Harrisburg mail carrier named William Unsell, he was unaware of an unwritten law. No one had ever told him that Charlie had declared crime off limits in Harrisburg, where Birger and his family lived. Page 252. The following day, Sheriff Small arrested Joe. The young would-be gangster couldn't figure out how anyone could have known it was he who had sent the postman to his maker. Since Small didn't say what he was arresting him for, Joe decided to keep quiet. Therefore, when he was put in a cell with Charlie Birger himself, he was ecstatic. "Mr. Birger, what are you doing here?" "Just paying my yearly respects to Sheriff Small." Charlie lay on a cot smoking. "What they got you in here for, Joey?" "I don't know for sure. Probably for being the best-looking kid in town." He snickered at his own wit. "I heard they were bringing you in for your own safety," Charlie said, without looking at him. "You heard what?" "Yeah, they said you killed Bill Unsell last evening." Charlie now stared at him as if really seeing him for the first time. "I didn't know you was a gunfighter, Joey." To have been paid a compliment by the likes of Charlie Birger made the young man's chest swell. "Well, I ain't killed nearly as many as you did by my age, Charlie, but I expect I got time to catch up." "I sure hope so." Charlie looked away again, as if he had doubt. "Why'd you say they brought me here for my own protection?" "Haven't you heard? The crime boss handed Joe a cigarette. "They's getting up a lynch mob. Seems old Bill was a mighty popular fella." Joe loosened his tie. "Lynch mob?" Charlie sat up. "Don't be frettin', Joey. I've been in your situation quite a number of times." "What'd you do, Charlie?" "Oh, I confess up every time. Seems all the law wants is someone to pin the crime on so they can look good in the public eye. They usually keep me in lockup for a few weeks or months, then send me home early for good behavior." "How'd you kill him anyway, Joey?" Joe wasn't prepared to relive that moment. "Talking about it just don't seem right with me." "Well, I'll tell you what, Joey. You tell me how you did it, and if they try to hang you, I'll have my gang break you out." Joey thought about his options. There must be truth in what Charlie said, but he hadn't planned on reliving the killing before he could reinvent it to make himself look better. He really didn't want anyone to know the assassination had nearly been botched. The moment was clearly imprinted on his memory. Joe told the story as best he could. His was the dreamy talk of a dissatisfied criminal. A few moments later, a deputy came and unlocked the cell. "Sheriff wants to see you, Charlie." In leaving, the crime boss nodded a friendly goodbye to Joe, who flushed with gratitude. The youngster felt a certain sadness seeing the famous gangster leave. He hoped Charlie didn't think him incompetent for his sloppy killing. He immediately resolved that if he got out of this predicament, he would never again perform a holdup without wearing a mask. A few moments later, Charlie and the deputy arrived at the sheriff's office. When the gangster entered the room, John Small and the state's attorney stood and gave him a disconcerting look. Charlie sat down in the chair, put his feet up on Small's desk. The sheriff handed him a whiskey, and the state's attorney gave him a cigar. After Charlie was comfortable and ready, he related to the two men everything the young murderer had told him. A month later, Joe Chestnut was hanged. Charlie was flashy and flamboyant. He always kept a large number of men guarding his shady rest hideaway. The Shelton gang were different. They were family-oriented. They preferred to farm out their assassinations and illegal things to a gang in St. Louis called the Cuckoos. Carl Shelton lived from 1888 to 1947. He was the leader of the Shelton gang. At 6'2", he was always dapper and well-dressed. A teetotaler who seldom drank alcohol, he was a Robin Hood type who gave freely to less fortunate. He had barbers shave him twice a day, got manicures, and then worked with hogs and mules on the farm. He liked to carry pearl-handled Frontier model revolvers. At his Methodist church, Carl taught Sunday school and played the piano. This picture shows him playing the piano for his wife and his girlfriend. Earl Shelton lived from 1890 to 1986. He was very personable, clever, humorous, and friendly. Earl had a talent for throwing a quarter in the air and having a $5 bill float down. He took his dog Duke everywhere, and often transported goats, calves, etc. in his expensive cars. And he always had a .45 tucked under his belt. Bernie Shelton lived from 1899 to 1948. This darkest of the Sheltons was hot-headed and very violent. He quit school after a couple of grades. In my novel, I have him saying, "We go to church every Sunday, unless there's someone who needs killed." This is one of Charlie's trucks used to carry bootleg liquor. It is on display in Bob Ray's Antique Car Garage in Benton, Illinois. Unbelievably, The violence of the bootleggers was outdone on June 21st and 22nd, 1922. The famous Heron Massacre occurred. Hundreds of United Mine Workers, men, women, and children, captured 50 strikebreakers, murdering 19 of them. This 1949 painting by Paul Cadmus depicts the brutal slaying of the 6 strikebreakers who were dragged to a pit near Heron, Illinois on June 22, 1922. Ora Thomas lived from 1891 to 1925. A member of both the Shelton and Birger gangs, he was a slim, quiet man, but fearless. It is doubtful Charlie or the Sheltons were involved in the Heron Massacre, but dual gang member Ora Thomas most certainly was there, and on the side of the United Mine Workers. As bootlegging empires emerged, the Ku Klux Klan was formed to enforce alcohol prohibition. The 1915 silent movie, Birth of a Nation, has been called the most influential film of all time, and not in a good way. It was the first film ever shown in the White House, and President Woodrow Wilson, himself a racist, loved it. Glenn Young was born in about 1887, and he died in 1925. He was raised with a pistol in his hand and astride a horse. Short but sturdily built, he was very smart with a photographic memory. He was also mean and loved to fight. He had been a Texas Ranger, and during World War I, he worked for the government tracking down deserters in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Glenn Young was chosen to lead the Ku Klux Klan against the Birger and Shelton bootlegging enterprises. Young was credited by his brother Leo with killing 21 men in his life, but Leo added he never pulled a gun first. His bootlegging raids on speakeasies earned him the title the Little Napoleon of Williamson County. Even his appearance was attention-getting. Pearl-handled pistols and machine gun in hand. On May 23, 1924, Glenn Young and his wife Maud were ambushed by the Shelton brothers as they drove along an Okaw Valley dirt road. Both were shot but survived. Maud was blinded for life from buckshot to the face. Below is the Lincoln that the Youngs were in when the Shelton gangs ambushed them. The picture on the right is of Glenn in a Catholic hospital after the attack. This is a picture that the Ku Klux Klan used as propaganda to gain sympathy for their organization. It shows Maud Young months after she was blinded by the Shelton gang ambush. On August 30th, the courts ruled that there was not enough evidence to prosecute the Shelton brothers for the shooting of Glenn and Maud Young. Therefore, the brothers went to the Smith garage to pick up the car that was allegedly used in the shooting. When they got there, there was a confrontation with Ku Klux Klan members. A shootout resulted in 6 men being killed. Following this shooting, the Sheltons had to get out of Little Egypt, so they went on a bank robbing spree throughout central Illinois. Things got pretty hot, though, when they tried to rob the bank in Kincaid, Illinois on September 27th. The bank alarm went off, so the Sheltons grabbed what little loot they could and dragged a cashier hostage to their getaway car. Hearing the alarm, a dozen Kincaid residents came out of the buildings and started shooting at the gang. Carl and Earl both dropped the money, as well as Carl's favorite sawed-off shotgun. They sped out of town, before releasing their hostage. Meanwhile, back in Heron, Illinois, Orr Thomas once again played a major role in the bootleggers' war against the Ku Klux Klan. Page 169. Folks have been talking about the Heron Massacre for 3 years. It seemed to Glenn every discussion led to a different conclusion as to whose idea it had been to kill the scabs. But when he and 2 of his bodyguards walked into the European Hotel's Canary cigar store in Heron on Saturday night, a brash young coal miner named Elias Green had the audacity to boldly claim that the whole thing had been Glenn's fault. "You were the ones protecting them scabs until it got too hot for you," Green shouted at him. "Then you and them Chicago thugs hightailed it out of there in the middle of the night. You left them 50 scabbies high and dry so we could butcher them the next day." "I ain't never protected no scabbies," Glenn lied, "and I weren't never at that Heron mine." "Hell yes you were there, Glenn," Orr Thomas said as he entered the store and stood with both hands in his overcoat pockets. "I seen you kill 2 of our Union boys that day, before you ran yellow for the hills later that night." "Don't pull that gun, Orr," Glenn shouted as he reached for his own firearms. The 2 bullets from Orr's pocket shots ended up a few inches below Glenn's neck. As he was being blasted backwards, the former Texas Ranger only had time to tilt his side holsters up and fire through them. It was a technique he'd used in previous gunfights. One of his bullets drilled the Shelton brothers' best friend through the face. The screen immediately poured through the windows, shattering the glass and sending Glenn's 2 bodyguards flying backwards into the big glass cigar humidor. Elias Green made it out the back door and into the hotel lobby, but Glenn, seeing he was the only one not quite dead, crawled slowly toward the open archway into the barber shop. When he tried to push with his knees, they kept slipping in the trail of blood gushing from the holes in his chest. He was just able to round the corner when he bumped heads with the pretty manicure girl who was trying to squeeze under a table next to the shoeshine boy. "Sorry," the girl whispered. "That's okay," Glenn gasped. Then he lost consciousness. This is an actual picture of Orr Thomas's funeral at his home. At this same time, the Shelton brothers were robbing the Collinsville mail carrier. They used Orr's funeral as their alibi. Glenn Young's funeral was much more elaborate. The Klan claimed that 80,000 people had been counted. Klansmen came from 19 different states, bringing truckloads of flowers, wreaths, bouquets, and floral designs. This is a picture of Glenn Young's son Bobby, 23 months old. He was photographed soon after his father died in the cigar store shootout. Once again, the Illinois State Militia were in Heron, Illinois to keep the peace. Our story picks up in the days following the Glenn Young-Orr Thomas gunfight of January 25, 1925 in Heron, Illinois. Charlie was shocked to get thrown into the Harrisburg jail so soon after his release from Danville. He suspected it was because of the many rumors stating that he had arranged the Thomas Young gunfight. As he had predicted, the Klan was riled to the point of violence. Raids on bootlegging joints intensified. In fact, the other boys incarcerated with Charlie were mostly small-time hill folk who hadn't even heard about the gunfight until the Klan raided their stills. The body odor and uncleanliness of the overcrowded cells made Charlie wistful for his Danville apartment-like incarceration. Sheriff John Small's pudgy wife, Cora, was one of the only highlights of the entire experience. Cora struggled to keep the prisoners well fed. She also scolded them like school children when they misbehaved. One of the rednecks in a cell near Charlie's was an idle-brained young man named Leroy. The other prisoners liked to tease Leroy because he collected bed bugs, cockroaches, flies, and spiders, and struggled to keep them controlled in a half-filled matchbox that he kept under his mattress. He claimed he was protecting the little critters from the bug oil that was sprayed on the mattresses and around the cells every few days. At first it was funny to watch the boy's face light up when someone brought in an insect for his collection. It seemed harmless entertainment until the day one of the more hardened criminals smashed the matchbox with his foot. Leroy went into a wild rampage and beat the bigger man senseless. Cora came in and threw a bucket of dishwater on the boy to calm him down. The bug murderer was unconscious, so Leroy just crawled onto his mattress and started crying. One of the other inmates felt sorry for the boy, so he scooped up the matchbox and gently put it in its place under the mattress. Everyone was asleep when the unconscious man woke up, shook his head, and saw the matchbox sticking out below Leroy's mattress. He took a safety match and lit Leroy's little bug mosque. The unlit matches in the box exploded, and the mattress went up in flames. Leroy leapt to his feet, took off his shirt, and fanned the flames. A horrible gas developed from the bug oil-drenched mattress. Screaming men, including Charlie, dropped to the floor to seek fresher air. When Cora ran into the lockup, the men jumped to their feet and begged her to let them out to escape the fumes. "But I'm alone in the jailhouse," Cora shouted. "My husband and our deputies are out bird-dogging bootleggers." "Cora," Charlie pleaded, "if you let us out, I'll personally guarantee that no man will escape. You have my word." Cora fumbled with the keys. She unlocked Charlie's cell, then ran back into the sheriff's residence. Charlie unlocked the other cells. "If any of you tries to escape," Charlie shouted, "I'll have my boys hunt you down and kill you." Later that night, when Sheriff Small returned, every prisoner was accounted for and sitting on the lawn. Cora and Leroy walked around serving coffee. For his heroics at the fire, Charlie was quickly released from the Harrisburg jail. Then on March 18, 1925, a 2-mile-wide tornado ripped through Missouri, southern Illinois, and Indiana, killing 695 people. Charlie feared that his estranged wife Beatrice had been in Murfreesboro, which was almost completely destroyed. She wasn't, but both the Shelton and Birger gangs joined forces to help rebuild the communities. Angela Mason's book Death Rides the Sky tells the incredible story of America's worst tornado. It is available on illinoishistory.com. With the Ku Klux Klan disappearing, the Shelton and Birger gangs began to fight over roadhouses, slot machine money, and, of course, women. Helen loved having affairs with gangsters. She cheated on Charlie Birger by having an affair with Carl Shelton, thus further driving a wedge between the rival gangs. In fact, one of them may have even had her poisoned. Page 224. Helen knew the minute she saw Connie Ritter she had to have him. Never mind that he worked for Charlie Birger to help keep track of money. She had never seen an accountant who was so big and handsome. He could have been a film star like Jack Pickford. His good looks made his deficiency in the bedroom all the more frustrating. "What the hell kind of copulation is this?" Helen shouted after 30 seconds into the process. "Why don't they provide every male a book when he's born so he'd know how to play his instrument for a woman when they fornicate?" "I'm just trying to be slow and gentle," Connie answered. "To hell with that. I don't want an easy lope, you fool. I want a hard trot." Helen would not be denied her amusement. She probed inside his long johns. "Now give it to me fast and hard." Connie didn't know how to respond. When Helen slapped him so hard his head swam, he figured she was done with him. But a moment later, He lay on his back with the Shawneetown dame riding him like a bronco in a rodeo. And she didn't stop just because she quickly finished. For the next hour she hit and bit Connie in places he'd never been hit and bit, cussed him and tossed him all around the room into positions on the furniture that he was pretty sure the designers had never anticipated happening. Their breathing was hoarse and raw and became synchronized. Both were covered in sweat, making their skin slide easily against each other. When she finally told him he could go, Connie, never certain what she would do next, grabbed his clothes and ran outside to the chicken coop to get dressed. The hens were not happy to have their home so abruptly invaded, and they let him know it by pecking and flapping at him. Connie figured there was nothing that they could do to him that the Shawneetown dame had not just done. The Blonde Bombshell. While no one knows her real name, we know she existed. A nightclub singer and dancer who partied hard with Helen Holbrook. Page 295. After several weeks, Connie had grown accustomed to Helen and Blondie's wild ways, and even enjoyed the lazy days in bed with the two beauties. When one of the boys popped a stranger passing through Little Egypt, he decided to make the corpse a gift to them. Helen and Blondie had the time of their lives with the dead body, which they kept on top of Helen's large, flat party roof. Each day, the ladies would bathe and dress him as if he were a store-bought doll. Then they posed him on chairs, stuck a cigar in his mouth, and put a drink in his hand. When guests arrived, they loved to place bets on how long it would take them to recognize the well-dressed man sitting with his legs suavely crossed was a stiff. Since the corpse was a small man, Helen liked to drag him out on the dance floor and trip the lights fantastic with him while Blondie sang. They call her Flamin' Mammy. She's the hottest thing in town. When it comes to lovin', she's a human oven. She can really mow 'em down. Every time she shimmies, every time she shake, Mammy do more damage than the San Francisco quake. Mammy loved her way to hell. She loved the devil, and she loved him well. Little devil running up and down the hall, saying, "Do something, Daddy. She's going to love us all." The handsome corpse was nicknamed Smoky. He was the life of the party for several nights, until one morning the girls came out on a roof to prepare for the festivities and found his face eaten away by wildlife. The next day they held a funeral for Smoky with a bullet in his forehead. Over 100 people came to the wooded area near a hog lot that Connie owned. Helen and Blondie cried all day. Following the Heron Massacre, the Tri-State Tornado, and all the gunfights between the KKK and gangsters, Reverend Harold Williams was able to convert thousands in Little Egypt during his tent evangelical ministries. Page 209. The first thing Carl noticed when he returned from a business trip in Florida was the absence of weaponry on the streets. Signs all over town told of churches and tent revivals where someone named Reverend Williams would be speaking for the next several weeks. Not only were there fewer guns, but more smiles and even greetings from citizens who Carl had always assumed despised him. "Good morning, Brother Carl. Praise the Lord for a glorious day, Brother Shelton. Grace to you and peace to your family, Mr. Carl. The Lord be with you, Mr. Shelton." "What the hell is wrong with this town?" Carl shouted when he entered the barber shop. His brothers were already there and pacing the floor like alley cats. Bernie pulled his revolver and stationed himself in front of the window. "I don't know, but I'll shoot the next son of a bitch who says he'll pray for me." "It's that new evangelical that's in town," Earl grumbled. "This town's got a bad case of religion. He's got the whole county so head up on being saved, business at the roadhouses is down nearly 50%. "Everything is down?" Carl asked in disbelief. "Alcohol, gambling, and whoring?" Well, not horn yet, Earl admitted, but it might be if that preacher man ain't stopped. So what are you boys doing about it? Carl sat at the barber chair where his face was immediately covered with a hot towel. I sent Charlie Briggs to have a visit with Reverend Williams, Earl said. You sent Briggsy? Carl shouted, ripping the hot towel off his face. Why, he ain't talked to nobody since Jack Skelcher got killed. I didn't tell him to talk, Earl said. I loaned him a revolver that belongs to John Smith, the Klan leader. That way we get rid of two enemies with one bullet. Hey, here comes Briggsy now, Bernie said. He shut the curtain and turned toward the door, pistol still in hand. Charlie Briggs walked into the barber shop, a smile on his face. It was not the smile that Briggs displayed after a killing or a good fist fight. It was a smile of contentment and peace. Peace be with you, brothers. Briggs grasped his hands together and gave a slight bow. He looked directly at Bernie. I've been praying for you, my friend. Earl jumped forward and grabbed the gun out of his brother's grasp. That action saved Charlie Briggs's life, but not his faith. It took Bernie resorting to his fist to beat the holiness out of the young gangster. A month after the tri-state tornado, the Birger and Shelton gangs fought together one more time against the Ku Klux Klan. This was the Election Day gunfight, in which 6 men would die, including Charlie Birger's best friend, Orb Treadway, and one of the Shelton gang members named Charlie Briggs. Art Newman began as a friend of both Charlie and the Shelton brothers. He took offense to the Sheltons trying to burn his house down, and then having Charlie Gordon try to kill him. Newman beat Gordon to the draw, but then went into hiding in southern United States. He eventually returned and sided solely with the Birger gang. Page 216. Art figured out the second that Charlie Gordon reached for his guns that the Sheltons were trying to get him killed. The dynamiting should have created enough suspicion, but when Earl told him there was a profit to be made on the whiskey purchase, he had lowered his guard, letting his greed get the best of him. As luck would have it, Charlie had tried to pull both weapons out of his shoulder holsters at the same time. Otherwise, Art would have never been able to outdraw him. For some reasons, several gangsters had recently been trying to use a Bill Hickok cross draw. In theory, it was a glamorous idea, but in practicality, it required the shooter to be able to clear the weapons of each other during the draw, an ability that Charlie Gordon had not seemed to have mastered, not as well as Wild Bill. Art was feeling so proud of having dropped the would-be assassin, he stuck around to brag about it to the law. It also helped that there were several witnesses who saw the entire gunfight and wanted to slap the winner on the back and buy him around. It was only when he got to his room in Arlington the next morning and told Bessie about his exploits that she made him understand the seriousness of having the Shelton brothers put out a contract on him. We've got to get out of town, Art shouted, then began crying and breathing heavily. Out of town, hell, Bessie squealed as she pulled a suitcase from the closet. We got to get out of the state. Blonde Bessie Newman's hate for the Sheltons reached its peak the day that their gang members shot at her in the leg. She had never liked Carl's aloofness, and though Bernie was sometimes a riot at party time, he was scary when crossed. Earl was the only one she could halfway tolerate. She'd even lay with him on occasion, but he was usually more inclined to turn a buck than pay for a jaunt in a sack. The attempted assassination occurred as Art and Bessie were traveling west on Route 13 highway near Harrisburg. Roads in the country always scared Bessie, not because of their haunting appearance at night, but because of all the critters that ran out in front of their car. The little animals that only left blood on her front fender weren't the problem. It was deer that scared Bessie, especially the ones with antlers. The wife of a local farmer had recently been bludgeoned to death when a 6-point buck tried to hitchhike a ride by leaping through their front windshield. The farmer was so upset he even refused to eat the sausage that the deer meat was ground into, though he did sell it to help pay for his wife's funeral. When a big truck came around the curve toward the Newman car, Art didn't even think much of it until he noticed it was a gas tanker with gun ports and a rifle sticking out of each. It was less than 50 yards away when the tanker slowed, and so did Art. He recognized Connie Ritter on the driver's seat. Because of the deep ditches on either side, there was no room on the little country road to turn around and run. The tanker would easily ram his car if he tried. It was inching slowly toward him when Bessie finally saw the danger. She screamed and grabbed for her husband's arm. He pushed her away, his brain searching for a solution. The weapon sticking out of the gun ports would have limited mobility. With nowhere to go but forward, he impulsively floored the accelerator and ducked sideways as low as he could get in the seat. The bullet shattered the windshield and struck like hell against the side of the car. The moving vehicle almost flipped over when he piloted it along the embankment of the ditch. Somehow it stayed upright, rubbed hard against the culvert till it broke free. When Art estimated that he was clear of the tanker, he set up, back down by bullets hitting the back of his car. Bessie screaming as she drove for the back seat didn't help his ability to blindly navigate the vehicle. "Shut up that caterwauling," he yelled as the machine gun mounted on the back of the tanker stopped. He sat up in his seat and grabbed the steering wheel just in time to prevent them from going off the road and hitting a tree. He glanced over his shoulder. The truck struggled to turn around on the side road. He could outrun the heavy tanker. "I gave them Shelton boys their start in the rackets," Art complained. "As soon as they make it big, they shoot up my car." "Not to mention your wife," Bessie said. "Why do you keep going when you saw them guns?" Art glanced back over the seat. It was just like his wife to not appreciate the scrap he had just got them out of. She lay on her side, holding her bloody dress against a wound beneath her buttocks. "Don't be blaming me for that, woman. If you'd have lost weight when I told you, you'd have moved a lot faster." As the feud grew worse, Birger had Shady Rest fortified with iron plate and machine guns. "Let any of them Shelton scumps try to rush us," Charlie said, "and they'll squirt blood like a ripe tomato." Page 300. "We knew something was up," Steve George said the next day at Shady Rest. "The Shelton gang drove that tanker right down Main Street with rifles sticking out the gun ports. I heard that slimy mayor of West City, Joe Adams, is hiding the tank for them in one of the warehouses." "Good thing we ain't next to an ocean," Connie said. "Them Sheltons would be attacking us with U-boats." "The Sheltons moved from one place to another so much, even they probably don't know where they're sleeping tonight," Charlie said. "I'm starting to think Shady Rest is a liability. Having all us gathered in one place may not be such a good idea after all." "Maybe we need to fortify," Connie suggested. The gang boss paced. He wasn't sure he didn't want to go into a rage. He'd done it before. Sometimes a good tizzy fit made him feel better. Still, Connie's idea was one Charlie had thought of before, back when he'd first gotten the idea of Shady Rest. It had seemed a good plan then, so why not now? But he knew why he had doubts. Carl Shelton had scoffed at the hideaway when he'd first seen it. "Trees close enough to your house, the enemy can hide behind them and shoot at you," he'd said. "High Pockets," Charlie yelled to McQuay. "You and Casey Jones take a truck into town and load up on canned goods, flashlights, water barrels, anything you can think of to have in the basement in case we're under siege." "Boss," Rado said, "I'll rig floodlights outside house, like ones used in coal mines." "Good idea," Charlie turned next to Steve George. "You find out where we can steal more ammunition and weaponry. I want to be fully prepared if they try to attack." The coal mine has a full armory, Steve stated, as if he'd always wanted to rob it. I'll get right on it. Connie, Charlie put his hand on his lieutenant's shoulder. I want you to take my car and bulletproof it. Mount a tripod machine gun on it. Have it ready by tomorrow night. Yes, sir. Connie raced out the door. We ain't gonna let them get away with what they did to Bess and me, are you? Art asked Charlie. Well, hell no, the boss shouted. Tomorrow night, we'll take down the roadhouse Connie was talking about. Maybe now the Sheltons will keep their noses clean. They ought to know better than to fool with Charlie Birger. If them Sheltons want war, they'll get it, Charlie yelled. Those cheap punks can't buck Charlie Birger. What do you want, Pop? Well, I hear that Max Pulliam and his gal are at a dance down in Heron. Oh, Charlie, you're not going to bother about him now, Helen pleaded. Come on, big boy. Be happy. Shut up, sister, Charlie said. Newman, send the boys after Pulliam. Birger gang member Max Pulliam came into disfavor with Charlie, who led a hit on him while Max was in a car with his wife and fellow gang member Wild Bill Holland. This incident is described on page 281 of 13 Steps for Charlie Birger. We join Max Pulliam as Wild Bill is driving the getaway car. Page 281. Bill Holland was called Wild Bill because he was anything except wild. Max was mildly irritated. The 21-year-old seemed to want to prove he deserved that nickname. Remaining calm, Bill piloted the getaway car as if he were out for a Sunday drive. Step on it, Holland, Max shouted. Mildred sat between her husband and Wild Bill, biting her fingernails. Wild Bill gave the big engine gas, and they quickly ate up several miles. Max relaxed when they were almost to Heron. Then as they came around a curve near the town cemetery, a car heading toward them blocked their lane. Two cars behind it also stopped. Wild Bill braked hard to a full stop, then shifted in reverse and backed up. A fourth car sped around the other cars and squealed to a stop on their driver's side. Charlie and Casey Jones leapt from the vehicle and opened up with machine fire. He was immediately riddled with bullets. His foot dropped off the accelerator. The roadster rolled to a stop. Max felt angry stings on his left side and right shoulder. He kicked the passenger door open, and while rolling onto the pavement, took another bullet in his back. Immediately following him was Mildred, who clutched at her right thigh. Damn this gun, Casey Jones shouted as he moved around to their side of the car, struggling to clear a jam. When he saw the his own weapon from beneath his jacket, he backed away quickly and the 3 shots Max fired at the sedan was encouragement enough for the Birger gang to make their exit. But not before Rado walked calmly over to behind the Oakland and blasted the back of Wild Bill's head. Max knew that when Charlie found out that he was still alive, he'd be after him. Listen, you gotta help me. All I want is a coffin and a hearse. All right, Pulliam, the undertaker said, but it's only because I hate Charlie and his mob. They'll never think of looking in a hearse, Max said. Birger's in for a disappointment. We gotta make this look good, though. I'll feel lots better when we're home, Max's wife Mildred said. As the hearse-bearing Pulliam leaves. They're leaving now. Get started, Mike. Any guy that would pull a corny stunt like that deserves to get knocked off, Charlie said. Max's mother, Nora, rode in the ambulance with him. Help, she shouted, when she saw Charlie Birger's car pull up beside them. "Pull that hearse over," Charlie yelled. "We want to make this funeral legitimate." "Ain't that nice, laying in the coffin, all ready for us," Art said. "What won't they do next?" "My hands are raised," the driver shouted as he exited the ambulance. The sight of Charlie Birger crawling into the back of his ambulance, carrying a machine gun, made the driver nervous. "That vehicle ain't insured for machine gun damage," he shouted from behind a tree. "Oh, well," Art laughed as he followed Charlie. "We wouldn't want you to get any holes in your hearse." Meanwhile, Charlie had his hands full trying to pull Nora off her son. She was strong and stubborn, so when he couldn't make her break her grip, he used the butt of his machine gun to get a few good licks in on Max's head. He managed to knock the man unconscious before Nora got her arm around her son's head to protect him. "Well, Max," Charlie said when he recognized he had to make a choice, "we don't intend to kill no woman to get to you. You'd better get out of this area and never come back." A moment later, the Birger gang members were back in their sedan and driving away. When Max regained consciousness in a hospital a few hours later, his wife and parents stood over him. His mother's arm was in a sling. "Why didn't Charlie kill me?" he asked. "I wouldn't let him," Nora cried, holding her bandaged arm up for him to see. "I took as much of the beating for you as I could, son." "Oh, Lordy, why did you do that?" Max shouted. He rested his forearm over his eyes. "Get out of here, woman. My ego could stand being killed by Charlie Birger, but I'll never be able to live down my mother saving my life." He took Mildred's hand. "I guess we'll go rob banks in Springfield, honey." Max Pulliam relates this incredible ambulance story in his memoirs written under the name Ralph Johnson. The book is co-authored and published by John Musgrave and available at illinoishistory.com. The gang war between the Sheltons and Birger was now in high gear. Carl used Charlie's paranoia from his morphine addiction against him. By using Helen as a mole, Carl convinced his rival that his own gang members were betraying him. On October 26, 1926, on orders of Charlie, his bodyguard Rado Milich and Euro Gowan killed fellow gang members High Pockets McQuay and Ward Casey Jones. Rado was later tried and hung for Jones's murder. Carl decided that since the Shady Rest was too far back in the woods to attack, the next best object would be the barbecue stand on Route 13. It stood in front of the road leading to Charlie's Shady Rest cabin. The trouble was, he sent his brother Bernie, who was drunk at the time, and Blackie to do the bombing. Page 310. The trip to the barbecue stands in front of the entrance to Shady Rest was uneventful. Bernie seemed in control, although very quiet. Blackie had him do a drive-by at a few minutes before 2. As he had predicted, several Birger men stood on the porch smoking and waiting for their replacements. It was when Blackie had Bernie parked behind some bushes a half-mile away that the problem started. The youngest Shelton's eyes grew heavy and his head began to nod. When Blackie shouted, "Let's go," Bernie double-clutched, killing the engine. He got it started again, but swerved several times trying to pick the car up to its maximum speed of 60 miles an hour. Blackie had a 10-second fuse on the bomb, and had practiced that day leaning half his body out the window so he could get a good throwing motion. He lit the fuse at the right time for the release, but for some reason, Bernie thought he had one more shift to get to 5th gear. His struggling with the grinding clutch slowed the car just enough that Blackie had to throw the bomb early. Blackie knew the second he released the package he had missed. It fell just short of the front porch. The explosion, though, was greater than he anticipated, causing Bernie to completely lose his grip on the steering wheel. Blackie reached over and grabbed it, just in time to prevent the car from skidding off the hard road. When Bernie took the wheel again, Blackie hurried to look back. The front porch was completely gone. Every window in the house was broken, but otherwise the target seemed undamaged. He settled back in the seat and glared at his driver. With both hands on the wheel, Bernie was sound asleep as they cruised down the highway at 50 miles an hour. Disgusted, Blackie pulled the gangster's foot off the accelerator, took the steering wheel, and guided the machine to a stop. Without a foot on the clutch, the automobile sputtered and died. He got out of the car, walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, and shoved Bernie down on the floorboard, where he promptly puked a stinky gray mess. After driving back to their roadhouse, Blackie parked the car and went inside to give his report, leaving the tough Shelton brother to wake up the next morning with his face in his own vomit. When a World War I Jenny landed near Fairfield, Illinois, the Sheltons hired the pilot to drop homemade bombs on Charlie Birger's Shady Rest retreat. That was on November 12th, 1926. You got any ideas? Earl asked. Hey, look, it's Joe Adams. What brings you out of the West City, pal? I read the papers, boys. I figured as how you might be hankering for a way to get to Birger. I think I brought the answer. Yeah, I'm listening, chum, Carl said. Who's the guy with you? He's the answer. This is Elmer Kane, and him and his machine were forced down in West City this afternoon. I brought him along with me to... Cut the gab, Adams, Earl interrupted. What are you driving at? We ain't got all day. Okay. What would you think of dropping a few bombs on Charlie Birger's little place and blowing him to bits? Kane will take the job for $1,000. Ray Walker was the Shelton gang member who most likely was the one to go up in the airplane with pilot Elmer Kane to drop bombs on Shady Rest. Picture here with an unknown woman. Next day at Shady Rest. Hey, since the boss got the joint fortified, there ain't been anybody come within miles of us. Hey, look at that plane. Someday I'll ride in one. That guy's nuts. He'll be spread all over the landscape if he ain't careful. If he tries that again, I'll blow his brains out. Look out, he's dropping bombs. Knock that yellow-bellied skunk right out of that fancy machine of his. When I find out whose bright idea that was, Charlie screamed, I'll croak him, so help me. This is an authentic photograph of the unexploded bomb that was dropped on Charlie Birger's Shady Rest hideaway by the Shelton brothers. The other blew up their gambling house. Although no one had been hurt by the bombing, Birger's pride had been weakened, and he thirsted for revenge. Charlie, I found out that Joe Adams was the guy that brought that aviator around. Yeah, Charlie said, he ain't very bright, is he? Let me have the phone. Hello, that you, Mrs. Adams? It don't sound like you. Where's Joe? If you ain't got any insurance on his life, you better get some. We're gonna kill him. The night of December 6th, Birger called in 2 of his younger triggermen for a conference. I want Adams rubbed out, and I want it bad, Charlie told him. Okay, Birger. Ray, Izzy the Jew Highland drove the Thomason brothers to kill Joe Adams. Harold Thomason was 17 to 19 years old when he killed him. He was sentenced to life in prison and paroled out in 1951. "These are my orders," Birger said. "This note is phonied up so they'll think it's from Shelton. Use it to get Adams out. Get your slugs from Izzy Highland, the guy that'll drive you. They got a special message on them. Here's them bullets Birger had split and poisoned," Izzy the Jew said as he handed the bullets to the Thomason brothers. "He ain't taking any chances that Adam will recover. He sure ain't. At $50 a slug, we ain't likely to miss. We got a message from Carl Shelton. He says to give it to Mayor Adams personally." "That looks like Carl's writing. Just a minute, I'll call him." This is an authentic note that the Thomason brothers gave to Joe Adams. It says, "Friend Joe, if you can use these boys, please do it. They are broke and need work. I know their father." It's signed CS for Carl Shelton. "Howdy," Joe Adams said when he comes to the door. "My wife tells me you got a message from Shelton. I'm Adams." "Yeah, we got something for you, ain't we, Elmo?" Later, back at Birger's headquarters. "We put 4 slugs into him," Harry Thomason said. "He didn't even know what happened. That'll be $200, Birger." "Okay, boys. I'm sorry I ain't paying you more." In the months to follow, Charlie Birger began to fear that some of his gang members would rat on him for the murder of Joe Adams. On January 27, 1927, Birger bombed and set fire to his own shady rest to get rid of 4 of his gang members he thought might snitch. A state policeman named Lori Price received rewards for the recovery of 19 stolen cars. Birger gang would steal them. State's Attorney Arlie Boswell would find out how much they were worth. Then the Birger men would leave them for Officer Price to recover. The 3 split the rewards. At first, the Sheltons were the suspects of the Shady Rest fire. But State Trooper Lori Price told a story that seemed to suggest Birger started the fire himself. Inside the building were 4 people who could implicate Charlie in the Joe Adams murder, including Elmo Thompson. State Police Officer Lori Price and his wife Ethel were asleep in their beds when Charlie and his gang tied them up and took them to the ruins of Shady Rest. "Maybe this'll amuse you too, Lori Price, you dirty stool. Get him out of here, boys. I can't stand to look at him." Meanwhile, 3 of Charlie's other gang members took Lori Price's wife Ethel out to an abandoned mine shaft. Despite her being pregnant, the gangsters had their way with the beautiful Ethel Price. They then killed her and threw her body down a mine shaft. Meanwhile, Charlie and his boys placed a badly wounded Lori Price in a sedan and went into the countryside to find a place to dispose of his body. Charlie even sat on top of Lori in the back seat to further punish him. Then Charlie and Art Newman unloaded their Tommy guns into the unfortunate officer and left his body to rot. One FYI, Lori Price was the first Illinois State Police officer to die in the line of duty. Then a few days later, Charlie Birger had a bright idea on how to get rid of the Shelton brothers. He visited the office of the United States Attorney. "I happen to know who held up the postal messenger at Collinsville last year and clipped him for 25 grand, Charlie Birger told the state's attorney. "It was the Shelton brothers, that's who. Me and my boys will help you convict them. Charlie paid several of his gang members to testify against the Sheltons. On February 7th, 1927, they were sentenced to 20 years in Leavenworth Prison. But then Art Newman squealed on Charlie for the Lori and Ethel Price murders and told the authorities where to find the bodies. Meanwhile, Harry Thomason, angry that Charlie had killed his brother Elmo in the Shady Rest fire, snitched to the state's attorney that Charlie was behind the Joe Adams murder. Not realizing that his gang members were turning on him, Charlie agreed to turn himself in for questioning. He had one condition, that he be allowed to keep his Tommy gun with him just in case some of the Shelton gang members tried to kill him. The next morning, the sheriff tricked the notorious gangster into putting his weapon aside during his questioning. Birger had to know something was up when he walked into a courtroom filled with police officers. The state's attorney gleefully told him that Harry Thomason had testified that Charlie was responsible for the murder of Joe Adams. Before he knew what was happening, Charlie Birger was handcuffed and going back to the jail cell. To make matters worse for Charlie, the Shelton brothers were released after only 3 months in Leavenworth. That was because, with their boss facing the death penalty, several Birger gangsters testified that Charlie had paid them and even threatened them with their life if they did not testify against the Sheltons in their Collinsville bank robbery trial. A man named Phil Hanna was called the Humane Hangman because he was so sympathetic to the condemned. Hanna refused to take money for his service, but he did insist that he be allowed to take one memento from each hanging that he wanted. Charlie's friend and fellow gang member, Rado Milich, was also a Russian Jew. He was hung on October 21st, 1927, for murdering Ward Casey Jones on Charlie's orders. The hangman was Phil Hanna. One of Charlie's final requests was that he be allowed to have a photograph taken of his wife and 2 daughters. The night before his execution, Charlie posed outside his cell for a photograph. Notice his left hand has the ring finger missing. He claims that this was shot off. Some people say, though, it got infected after a fistfight. Looking dapper in his blue serge suit, Charlie Birger strutted down the jailhouse steps as if he were simply coming down for breakfast. He shook the hand of each deputy escorting him. When he stepped outside the building, men, women, and children were gathered for as far as he could see. Trees were filled, the most daring as high as the thinnest topmost branches. The roofs of every building had standing room only. Every window was filled, including the jailhouse, where his fellow inmates watched. It might have been a circus parade coming down Main Street, had it not been that on top of almost every roof were also policemen with mounted machine guns and seemingly hundreds of uniformed men mixed in with the crowd. "Looks like the Western Front here," Charlie joked. A few of those who heard him chuckled. The rest of the crowd grew strangely silent. Several men supported their women, who seemed close to fainting. "Howdy doody," Charlie said when he recognized a small group from Harrisburg. Were they thinking about the sacks of groceries he'd left on their front porches? He thought about asking them, but was afraid his voice might crack if he tried to say too much. Instead, he smiled and walked somewhat quickly. Rabbi Mazur was at his left elbow, quietly chanting prayers from the Torah. Though shackled, Charlie was able to shake hands with a few people who reached out to him. A large wicker basket beneath the gallows awaited to catch his body when he was cut down. So too was a black coffin he would lie in for eternity. He thought about what his girls would think when they saw their daddy stretched out in it. When he reached the bottom step of the gallows, he wanted to hesitate. but feared he might falter if he did. Instead, he stepped boldly, silently counting each time he raised his legs, all the way to the top. On his 13th step, he almost laughed. The hangman, Phil Hanna, had told him that he also used 13 coils in his noose. I reckon my unlucky number after all is 13. Charlie stepped onto the trap door and performed a military left face toward the crowd. He smiled and pointed and waved. Phil tried to hide the noose behind his back as a courtesy to the condemned. Feeling appreciative for the man's professionalism, Charlie extended his shackled hands, and Phil leaned forward to return the heartfelt handshake. "Please forgive me for what I'm about to do," Phil said for the 61st time in his illustrious career. "You're a great old boy," Charlie told him. "Any last words, Charlie?" Phil asked. "I have nothing against anybody," Charlie said. "I've forgiven everybody, all because of this wonderful Jewish rabbi. I have nothing to say. Let her go." The last human he made eye contact with was Sheriff Jeff Pritchard, who stood with his hand on the lever to the trap door. Charlie's was a withering death stare, half sneer, half grin. Phil Hanna raised the black hood with the long draping cape behind it, then hesitated for just a moment when Charlie raised his head and looked up at the blue, clear sky. Still smiling, the legendary gangster said one final sentence in a soft voice that carried only to those in the crowd who were nearest. "It is a beautiful world."
Yeah, Charlie killed the mayor out in West City. There in Franklin County he was tried. He was sentenced by the state April 1928. Was the day Charlie Birger died. Well, his lawyer got to stay, but the jury said he was sane. It only took 12 minutes to decide. So the hanging plan went on. 2 days later was the dawn of the day Charlie Birger died. There were people everywhere. It was a circus on the square. Ladies dressed up in their finest clothes. Well, they all showed up at dawn, had a party on the courthouse lawn the day Charlie Birger died. Charlie walked to the gallows, hangman slid on his robe. He asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Charlie said, "It's a beautiful world." The trap door filled his body twirled. The day Charlie Birger died. There were people everywhere. It was a circus on the square. Ladies dressed up in their finest clothes. Well, they all showed up at dawn, had a party on the courthouse lawn the day Charlie Birger died. The day Charlie Birger died. Sheriff calls it a crime. Preacher calls it a sin. I'm doing time. 'Cause I killed men. I killed men. I killed men. Never a good one.
If you enjoyed the readings from this book, you can pick up a copy of 13 Steps for Charlie Birger on Amazon for $15 in paperback and $5.99 in Kindle. Also, historian and author John Musgrave from Southern Illinois distributes it to many of the bookstores throughout that area.
Milk is always spoiled. I killed men. I killed men. I killed men. Never a good one. I killed men. I killed men. I killed men.
Bootlegger Heaven, the Shelton Gang story, is a sequel to 13 Steps for Charlie Birger. The back cover reads, "Hang up your guns and enjoy life before the bullet sends you to Bootlegger Heaven." Infamous gangster Charlie Birger tells Carl Shelton. The next morning, Birger hangs. Carl, though, returns to his life as a bootlegger and leader of the Shelton Gang. Still, Birger's words haunt him. Retiring to his farm in Southern Illinois seems like an idyllic way for Carl to spend his golden years. Meanwhile, though, there are banks to rob, infringing mobsters to kill, and church to attend religiously. Black Charlie Harris grew up with the Shelton brothers and works as a hitman for the gang. Still, he resents the brothers' fame and fortune. Carl, always astute, realizes Black Charlie isn't happy, and unhappy mobsters are dangerous mobsters. So Carl frames Black Charlie. After 10 years in Leavenworth, Black Charlie is free on parole and filled with hatred for the Sheltons. While Carl contemplates retirement, Black Charlie calculates revenge. A sequel to 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, Bootlegger Heaven tells the incredible story of the bloody Southern Illinois region known as Little Egypt from the 1920s through the 1940s. Both novels are so closely based on historic events, the actual events are listed in the back of the books. Sundown Town, 16 Tons, and Throw Out the Water. These are other novels by Kevin Corley that tell the stories of Christian County, Illinois coal mining and the development of the United Mine Workers from 1898 through 1938.